Welcome, everyone. I'm Allison Brown, President of League of Women Voters Falls Church, and I welcome you for our conversation with Councilwoman Letty Hardi. We're very happy to have Councilmember Hardi today to talk with us about all the local issues that are so important to all of us and are moving quite fast. So I'm going to turn it over to Letty to give us an overview, and then we'll have time for questions. Over to Letty.
Thanks, Allison. And thank you to the rest of the league for kind of the invite back. Happy to kind of chat with you all, especially kind of coming off the election, and more attention can be focused on kind of the coming couple of years ahead now that we have kind of a new city council ready to be seated, new school board. So just jumping right in, I think last time I was with you all was probably really in the throes of COVID. And so where we are as a community is we are obviously still recovering. Vaccination rate luckily is pretty high in the community, and with 5 to 11-year-olds getting vaccinated, all I'm hearing is actually people scrambling to get their kids vaccinated. So that's good news all around. I think in terms of case rates, we're below 3%, although the new metric to watch is really what the CDC calls transmission rate. So everybody wants to know, like, well, do we keep doing masks indoors? I think the guidance we're getting from the health department is we have to see 28 days of transmission according to the CDC definition at moderate levels. And because we're part of that larger health district, I think we're still at the substantial level. So we're still above moderate. So it'll be a little ways to go. So keep those masks going. If nothing else, with the kids back to school, it'll help keep the cold viruses away, maybe, if we just keep our masks on through the rest of the fall and winter. But I know that we're all anxious to kind of be on the other side of it. But with the vaccinations now getting to the younger population, I feel like the light really is at the end of the tunnel, hopefully, fingers crossed. So that's good news. But that leads me to kind of talking about ARPA, which is the American Rescue Plan. That is the big kind of pot of money that everyone's probably heard about the city's getting. So one of the first things I always talk about when we talk about ARPA is it is not a blank check. It is not while it seems like a really big windfall and is a really great opportunity for the city, because 18 million, that's how much we're getting in total over 2 separate disbursements, is 18% of our annual budget. Our annual operating budget is $100 million. And so when you think about 18% of that, that's a pretty whopping amount of money. And so we are very grateful for it and need to be very strategic and thoughtful on how we're going to get that kind of allocated to various priorities. But the first thing is it is not a blank check. The city manager has done a good job with doing outreach to the community. I think we talked about it as council kind of through the summer, and we kind of laid out kind of here are guiding principles and how we think the dollar should be used, especially with those federal treasury rules in mind. And he's had a couple of town halls recently. There's surveys out to both the community and resident and business communities, kind of get input on how we'd like those dollars spent. If you haven't watched those town halls, I'd encourage you to look online. I'm happy to send it to the league afterwards, and you all can help distribute kind of that, because that really, hearing community input is really important. So again, to put in context, we have lots of input during budget season. So our operating budget of $100 million, this is 18% of it. And so this is important to hear from people. And I always have a strong belief that I especially want to hear from the people who don't traditionally get involved in government, right? The people who don't have time to come to a city council meeting Monday night at 7 o'clock. And so one of the silver linings from COVID is that so much of this is done virtually, and you can always watch meetings after the fact and access materials. So I'll send the links over to Allison, and hopefully we can get it distributed to the league members and we can hear from you. I won't go into too much of the details, but roughly how we are thinking of prioritizing it is out of the 18 million total, about 35 to 40% is going to go to infrastructure. And these are kind of long held priorities such as stormwater, affordable housing, things that we've talked about wanting to invest in the city, and this will help with that. There are rules from the Treasury on the types of infrastructure that can be used. Stormwater and sewer are the two that are named in particular. And so it just fits given that we've had stormwater as a need in the community. About 20% to services to disproportionately impacted communities, so lower income communities, as well as business communities that have been impacted. So that'll be things like potentially business grants. We did a couple rounds of that during COVID. 10% to those negatively economically impacted. So during COVID, we had done a series of rent, utility, and food relief to our neighbors in need. And so that will continue. And then another 15 to 20% towards public health. So continuing the vaccination campaigns, continuing testing materials, that sort of thing, that because we are definitely not out of the woods of the pandemic yet. Very little can go towards there's a category for revenue replacement. And because Falls Church, we always think of ourselves as, I think, what the mayor calls punching above our own weight. We try to get lots of grants, right? Because when we are small and we have about $100 million in operating budget, we go out and seek grants left and right for transportation, for housing. And so this is actually where it actually hurts us, because Treasury counts those grants as revenue. And so while we did have loss of revenue, obviously during COVID, because our sales tax and whatnot all went down, because frankly, no one was going out and spending money at restaurants and things, because we had those grants, that counts against our revenue loss. And so our revenue loss category ends up being pretty small. And so we can't, that's actually the most flexible category, but because of those grants, what's eligible towards that is actually pretty small. And so there's not as much that we can do towards that as we'd like, but hopefully things like traffic calming and transportation and pedestrian improvements can be covered there. So that's a pretty high level overview. Again, I'll send the links over to you all so that you all have a chance to look at kind of the detailed priorities. There's some things in there like parks, because so many people are spending more time outdoors, being able to invest in more outdoor facilities, and parks and recreation is kind of another example of kind of long-term infrastructure things. So I will pause there on kind of ARPA.
And I know there's surveys out to the general community and one out to the business community.
Yep.
And I mean, who developed the survey itself, and how are you going to make sure that the survey tool itself garners, input across the community, and also input that, is kind of there or you can fairly assess?
Yeah. So that's the first word, is they're not surveys. I think as a community, we need to be very careful because they're not going to be statistically significant or scientific. They are input forms. So think of them as a virtual suggestion box, right? So instead of a box where you can drop a card of comments of here's what I'd like to see, that's what we're using the input forms for, is to hear from more members of the community. If they can't come to a meeting, can't come to a town hall, or don't have time to write in kind of a lengthy email, this is a good way for them to send us input. So that's how we're treating them, is not which project gets X number of votes. It's really more open-ended input.
I was just curious, from my perspective, and I admit that I don't know that much, it seems that Falls Church has been very proactive about ensuring during COVID that people weren't evicted, that those in need had help. Do we have any sense of how Falls Church did in terms of ensuring that we were able to protect the most vulnerable? You hear in the news that there were lots of grants that no one took advantage of, and I was just curious how Falls Church did.
Yeah, according to our Health and Human Services Department, we didn't have evictions due to COVID. We might have had evictions due to other reasons, because there was kind of a pause on all COVID or all eviction hearings through the court system during COVID as well. But to my knowledge, because we're small enough that we'd like to think that we can reach kind of the vulnerable population more easily than a larger jurisdiction. What I've heard from the director of HHS is that we hadn't had any COVID-related eviction. So that's really good news. The last thing I'll mention on ARPA, because it kind of, sorry, go ahead, Alison.
Yeah, in terms of ARPA funds that are directed toward people in need, will they have to certify to a COVID hardship, or with the ARPA funds, is it more broad, just any kind of economic challenge you're having?
In the past, it's had to be, you had to show that it was impacted due to COVID, so you lost your job due to it. I don't know if the rules are the same for ARPA. Kind of outside of pandemic times, we offer emergency rent relief, for other circumstances. So I imagine that might be similar. The last thing I didn't mention that hopefully we can use ARPA dollars for is around hazard pay. And so during COVID, you might have heard something called the CARES Act. So that was essentially the first round of federal relief that all the localities had taken care of. We had gotten money through that and used that for things like the rent relief, but we also used it for hazard pay for frontline employees. And so at the time, only our police officers were eligible for that, again, due to various rules from the Fed. With ARPA, the rules are a little looser. So hopefully we can cover other frontline employees, because frankly, there's people that worked in City Hall throughout the pandemic. They couldn't socially distance, people in public works who are out in the trucks in the field, and obviously that's not the kind of job that you can do remotely from home. And so pay equity is personally really important to me. So wanting to make sure that we can pay all those frontline employees consistently across the board is important, as well as being able to catch them up on pay. Falls Church is not immune to what I think is called the Great Resignation happening across the US, right? So we have I think the latest was between 15 to 20% of our positions are currently open, and we're having a really hard time with staffing up. And so it doesn't matter what great policies and things we want to pass, unless we have great resources to actually get them done in City Hall, that they're not going to happen. And so getting through this hiring challenge will be an issue. And I think pay is definitely part of the equation. And so hopefully ARPA will help with both the hazard pay front, as well as getting caught up on where we are with pay in general. Other questions before I move off of ARPA? Or
I just had a random question on pay, which is on pay equity as it relates to gender equity. Has the city done anything to ensure that there is gender equity in the pay scales for the civil servants?
I don't know whether we looked at it on pay based on gender. What I know we started looking at is doing salary studies based on like job categories and benchmarking ourselves across other jurisdictions. For those of you with kids in the school system, you'll remember that the previous superintendent, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, declared that we wanted to be one of the top paying school districts across Virginia. And I think we are right now. We might be number 1 or number 2 in most years, which is great. It helps us attract talent. And obviously teachers are probably the most important part of what makes a school division great. I would love to make a similar declaration on the city side. I think just like city hall workers should be valued as well. And so looking at where the salaries are relative to our neighbors is really important in the near term while there's hiring challenges. But I think more broadly speaking, I think it's just a good thing to make sure we have equity across city and school hiring. But no, I don't think we looked at gender in particular, but definitely based on job type. Other questions on ARPA or pay before I move on? Okay, so the ARPA has been a big topic. The second topic I probably hear most about is really around pedestrian safety, traffic calming, transportation, kind of all things in general. So when I was looking back at my notes, back when we were going to have this in October, I heard lots of concerns around 20 miles an hour speed limits. So that was one thing that we actually had passed. So we had, out of the $18 million from ARPA, we made a mini appropriation about 1.1 million. So a very small percentage out of the total, but we wanted to get to those immediate priorities pretty early on and not sit on the pot of money to address things like rent relief and whatnot. As part of that, we actually appropriated some dollars towards new signs in anticipation that we would move to 20 miles an hour speed limits in various parts of the city. I think studies show that the lower the speed limit, it correlates directly to lower pedestrian fatalities. And so we've heard pretty loud and clear across the city that speeding is a problem. And I would probably concur with some of that. Well, there's my colleague, Phil. His face just popped up, which probably means Vipa's just got out. Hi, Phil.
Hi, sorry, Vipa's is still going on, but I had to leave them to come to you.
Oh, well, thanks for joining us, Phil. 20 miles per hour speed limit is one of the things that we wanted to get done as part of ARPA, with more people and pedestrians out in the streets. Obviously, everyone doing a lot more walking during COVID. We wanted to make sure that we continued our investment in safe pedestrian facilities. And again, with the data that shows that lower speed limits definitely leads to lower fatalities, that seemed like a natural thing to do. That said, nobody freak out yet. Broad Street's not going to turn to 20 miles an hour. That is a VDOT street. We have to do more work on figuring out which streets and which neighborhoods where that would be appropriate. It's likely not going to be your main streets and your big arterials. It'll be more like the neighborhood streets. If we needed to pilot it in certain areas, I would support near school zones, for example, right? So nobody really needs to go faster than that. But that is kind of on the horizon. That's something that's going to need a little more study, but I think it's something that largely has council support to do. Another part is really enforcement. So lowering speed limits isn't the only thing that's going to help slow cars down. Enforcement's definitely part of it. Street design is a big part of it, right? Because we are in a car-centric suburbia, and we are slowly kind of transitioning out of that and having to design our roads and not have super fast cars. So for example, when you're on East Broad Street and you're coming from Seven Corners, so heading westbound on East Broad, the street's really, really wide there. And that's why you often see a police, parked near Doolin Church, because the street is wide, it's straight, it's a double yellow with 2 lanes on each side. It just encourages you to use it as kind of a speeding area. To kind of redesign areas like that in parts of the city to make it harder for people to speed. So narrowing the roads down, doing things that you see on various parts of town that we've done. We've done one in Little Falls, one on Parker and Kent, kind of these little bump out areas. Not many people like them. They're kind of unpopular, but they really do pinch cars down enough to make them slow down. Having cars parked on both sides of streets is another way to kind of slow cars down, because again, it creates a perception that the street's more narrow and makes you slow down. So there's lots of things we can do around street design, speed limits. Speed cameras is something new that we gotten power from the General Assembly to do this past year. It's not that we're going to put speed cameras everywhere. Right now, again, the power is pretty limited, being a Dillon state. Definitely a mother may I situation. I think we can only do it in school zones and construction areas, but that's something that I feel like I've been a broken record on. Is I would love to get speed cameras in all areas, parts of town where we see, prone to speeding. And again, school zone seems like it would make sense, because realistically, you just can't have a police officer enforcing it at every intersection, every moment in time. and speed cameras have shown to be a pretty effective deterrent in other places that have them. So those are three big topics around transportation and kind of pedestrian safety. The WNOD, if you haven't been on recently, has opened in the past month with kind of dual trail. So we are the pilot for the region, so that's pretty exciting. As a runner, I certainly appreciate having extra road where I don't have to worry about a bicyclist whizzing by me. So that's really a pleasure to be on. The new Park and West intersection is a little tricky right now. So if you've been by recently, that redesign is part of the Founders Row 1 project. So instead of that old curve when you used to take West Street, where it kind of essentially curves you around the old 7-Eleven, there is now a proper four-way intersection. And so people should treat it as a four-way intersection with a light. And concurrently, there are new pedestrian signals at the WNOD. So again, it's a very complicated one. It'll take some time for us to get used to, but hopefully it'll be more pedestrian friendly in the long run and a safer way to kind of navigate that area. Any questions on pedestrian safety or?
Will you talk about the project at Hillwood near 29? I know the construction is we're in the midst of construction, but what's the vision there? What are the improvements? Is that for pedestrians or other kinds of transportation improvements?
That's a good question. So I do get asked about that. So, and Phil, feel free to chime in because that project long predates me. I actually want to say that it was Obama Great Recession era money, federal dollars that we had gotten to kind of as federal stimulus dollars. So it's definitely a long time coming. The project has probably taken longer than any of us would like, and we know it's a mess, certainly as a driver and a pedestrian. But one of the big changes is that slip lane. So if you were going northbound on South Washington, so essentially towards kind of past the Target before you get to Hillwood, there used to be the slip lane that you could take at 30 miles an hour, frankly. You kind of turn right and it would just kind of take you directly onto Hillwood really quickly. While super convenient for cars, that was very, very unfriendly to pedestrians. And traditionally, I think one thing I've griped about is, as a city, I don't think we had done as much investments on the south end of town as I'd like to see compared to the north end of town. So when we talk about equity, you just don't have as many people advocating for pedestrian safety improvements on South Washington, on Hillwood, on Annandale, compared to, say, if this were Broad Washington, if this were Park Avenue, if this was the north end of the city, you'd hear a lot more. And so while it's kind of a pain right now, I'm glad to see a lot of these changes. It is getting rid of that slip lane, turning into a proper T intersection. We are adding sidewalks, street trees, lighting all up and down kind of South Washington. So when it's all said and done, and again, we're right in the midst of all the mess right now, you'll see things like brick sidewalks and you'll see street trees and lights that you'll see elsewhere along Broad Street in North Washington. Hopefully it'll really better unify South Washington and give it more pedestrian improvements. And I think what we usually see is that when public investment happens, private investment follows. And so I think it's appropriate for us to put some dollars towards the South Washington area, which we haven't done as much before. And hopefully we'll see the businesses appreciate that, frankly, because it hasn't been the easiest to get in that area during construction and even before construction. But I know getting rid of slip lane is a little controversial. Some people really loved it because, again, it was great for cars. But imagine walking past that, and it was not so great. And then right in front of the cab area, that little triangle essentially turns into, I think what they call it's like a multimodal transit plaza. It's going to be essentially a really big bus stop. It's a lot more, again, transit friendly than it is today. And I think there's going to be some history panels. The history of Falls Church is going to be etched on these glass panels. I had seen a previous iteration of that kind of history about a year ago or now, but that's what's going to go in that transit plaza, which is right near the red top cab kind of triangle corner.
So when you say multimodal transportation, so buses and what are the other?
Buses, and I think bike racks probably. I'm trying to remember if there's a bike share that's supposed to be added there as well, but it's a big enough area that it should be hopefully all of those things. Mm-hmm. Phil, did I miss anything?
Nope, sounds right. Multimodal transit plaza. Yeah, that's been kicking around ever since Jim Moran was in Congress, and it was an earmark from stimulus money, Lord me, 12, 13 years ago, even before I was on council.
From the last recession.
Yeah, exactly.
My hope is that the ARPA allocation and spending is not going to take 10 or 15 years to get to.
What's the population center that would get to? Because I think if you live at Lincoln at Tinner Hill, that's still too far. You have a closer bus stop. So I'm trying to think who the population is that would use that bus stop. That's sort of, it's not far from Caribbean Plate, but it's not. There's not really an apartment building there, is there?
I think it's probably some of the areas that are south of 29. So all the side streets like Marshall, and the names all change on the other side of town, but hopefully it'll be a friendlier place to catch a bus with a shelter than the open air bus stops elsewhere.
Right, yeah. And there's a lot
Plus,
of
keep in
housing.
mind that that area is supposed to be, on the small area plan, projected for, 20, 30 years from now to be much more densely developed. So in effect, the transit would precede the development that we, like Letty said, hope to see there.
Okay. Mhm.
Letty, I'm sure there isn't a quick answer to this, but if there's a relatively short answer, why does it take, why would it take 13 years for something like that to come about? I mean, just sort of so we can be aware and watch for those things with other spending projects.
Yeah. So we've been warned that federal appropriations and federal projects, anytime you use federal dollars with grants, takes a lot longer. There's a lot more bureaucracy and red tape. This project in particular had a whole bunch of starts and stops. So because it was so long ago, obviously prices have gone up a lot. And so every time there was some delay, we end up having to find more money and wait for more grants and more dollars to be found. And so I think it's a combination of all those things. It's between, again, the federal grant taking a long time. As prices went up, we then had to go find more money to get the project done. And then most recently, I think we've had some trouble with this contractor in particular too. So probably a confluence of multiple factors. Okay, so I'm going in order of kind of things I hear most about. So we hit ARPA, pedestrian safety, speed limits, that sort of thing. Development is probably the next kind of big topic I always hear folks talk about. And so the two in particular that I'll just mention, just so your members know where they are, is Founders Row 2 and One City Center are kind of two projects kind of in the queue, so to speak. Founders Row 2 got an affirmative first reading vote, so it's in the hands of our boards and commissions. Developers are in the process. And let me pause there. Does everyone know what that means when I say it's past first reading? Okay. So most development votes happen after, or most development projects have two votes. The first one by city council is what we call the first reading. And that's when we essentially refer it out to boards and commissions for further work and iterations. Essentially, they go to each board and commission over the course of several months. They get a bunch of input. Developer goes back and incorporates that input into a final submission. And that's what comes to council. And then when we have a second vote, essentially what that gives them, if they're seeking a special exception approval, is essentially the entitlement. It doesn't mean the project's still going to get built tomorrow, because after that, they go through a site plan process with the planning commission. And so development's not a very short process, but I often hear people freaking out like, oh my God, this got a vote. And we're like, it's your first reading vote. It still means there's a long ways to go. And that's where Founders Row 2 is. They had a first reading vote. It's in the hands of boards and commissions. I expect probably by the end of the year, we'll hear back with, here's the feedback we got, here's what we're working on as the next submission, and then council will need to decide, is this ready to get scheduled for that second reading vote? So that's where that project is, and that is the corner of the other corner, Broad and West. That's the project with the perennially going out of business carpet store and the actually out of business Rite Aid. So it'll be the catty corner from Founders Row 1, and we'll have to come up with some different name. I don't know if we're going to call them Founders Row 1 and 2. But it is the same developer, the Mill Creek developers.
Letty,
Go ahead.
do you know more about when Founders Row 1 is going to be like open, or what?
Yes, so parts of it are open. We've had our first neighbors move in the past couple weeks or so, and we expect that to continue through the fall and winter. They told us maybe about 2 weeks ago that they have 3 signed leases for the retail tenants. All 3 of them are restaurants. They expect 2 more, and hopefully an announcement of all 5 of them combined around the Thanksgiving holiday. Their marketing people said it's better to announce a big group of them together. So we're trying to sit patiently on that. Obviously, the movie theater is a big part of that. The movie theater business obviously didn't do well during COVID, so probably not a great time to try to open a theater, but things have rebounded since Labor Day. So we're hopeful that, what they tell us are serious talks with a couple of movie vendors will proceed into signed leases. For those 5 restaurants that we talked about, I think the timeline is they'll be building out through the winter and then open in mid-spring or so, just in time to eat outdoors again. Phil, anything to add? I know Founders Row, both 1 and 2 are in your backyard.
No, I don't think so. Right. The restaurants that have signed leases are supposed to go in at the ground floor of the very corner building, what they call the senior building. The building's going to be age restricted, so it's sort of the highest visibility corner as you come into town, or where the first 3 restaurants are going to be.
So besides our new neighbors moving in, Founders Row 1 is actually the first project, which I feel like we've talked about for a long time, but it's the first project we have with affordable housing units that will never expire. Up until this point, we had negotiated ADUs that have a life of between 15 to 20 years or so, which we're kind of actually coming up on. We've had some that actually expired now because, like the Broadway and the Byron, for example, were about 20 years old, and some of those units have expired. And so it is a nice legacy to leave that when Founders Row opens fully, that all of those ADUs will never expire. And so while 6% is kind of, the old way of doing things, hopefully we'll see higher. It is nice that those 6% will never expire. So moving to the other project that's in the queue is what's called One City Center. That is the Broad and Washington corner where the 4 Ps is. Before people worry, the 4 Ps isn't going anywhere. The project essentially wraps around the existing George Mason Square office buildings. And I think it's 150 South Washington. That's an office building currently where the school board offices are in South Washington. Essentially would go from the South Maple corner to Broad and Washington. And so it'd be the back half of it kind of wrapping around that existing building. So they keep a couple buildings essentially, and then add a big new mixed use building. That one did not have a first reading vote. We actually deferred it. Several of us felt that we needed more time to work on various things. And so that hopefully will come back to council later this fall. Once I think they heard the feedback pretty loud and clear from us. So that's where we are with One City Center. Any questions on that? Is another mixed use project. That is kind of the general trend. So it'll be, I forget the exact number of housing units, maybe about 250 or so apartments there. And then a ground floor grocery store kind of on the corner of Broad and South Maple.
And will that likewise have low income that won't expire, or is it a different?
So it won't expire. Oh, forgot to mention. So Founders Row 2, let me go back a project. Founders Row 2 actually is proposing 12% affordable housing. So that's probably the highest that we've seen ever, which is terrific. And I want to be very transparent. So the 12% does come at the expense of other things, right? So they're giving us less concessions than other areas. But I've spoken about this before. I think that the trade-off is appropriate. We've made lots of investments in other areas like schools and parks. We're paying for all that through our CIP right now with a brand new high school, a new city hall, and new parks everywhere, new libraries. And so I think that trade-off personally is appropriate. Not everyone shares that belief, so I totally respect that. So the way we're getting 12% at Founders Row 2 is they're making less concessions in other areas. So they are committing that 12% of the units at Founders Row 2 will be affordable and never expire. So that is kind of a new high watermark for us. At One City Center, they are still proposing 6%. That is one of the things we have told them is we'd love to see that number go higher. These are all voluntary. So Phil and I, for example, can't demand that they give us more, but we can certainly say we'd like to see more.
Letty, for Founders Row 2, maybe it's too early to say, but is there a specific thing that builders are proposing? It is also mixed use, or?
It is mixed use. And the reason why it's mixed use is frankly, it didn't take COVID to obviously disrupt the office and retail market, right? Like how many of you are still working from home at least part of the time? Probably a large number of us. The office market in the region, even pre-COVID, wasn't great. And so mixed use right now is what's hot. It's where, everyone needs a place to live. I think the DC area is projected to grow a whole bunch. I think we need 300,000 housing units in the DC area. And so residential continues to be profitable and has a high demand. And frankly, it's okay to welcome new neighbors, in my opinion, in our community. So it is mixed use at Founders Row 2. It has a lower percentage of commercial because they're thinking of it as a complementary use to Founders Row 1. It'll be what they call neighborhood serving retail. On the ground floor there, what they have committed is that half of it's going to be restaurant use at Founders Row 2. But more of like a neighborhood coffee shop, bakery kind of thing is what I think they're proposing.
Congratulations. That's awesome to get the 12%. That's fantastic. I don't think I've seen it that seems to be a new high point across all of this region. Has anyone else got 12%?
It's always hard to do apples and apples comparison. You'll see some places that might have 15 or 20%, but they may not be getting concessions elsewhere, right? And so what we started doing actually with the recent projects is actually analyzing the value of the total bucket of concessions so that we can see, okay, if we're getting 12% here, but we're getting less there, is the total value of concessions on par with what we're seeing elsewhere, to make sure that we're still negotiating a good deal for the city. So often people will say, well, why aren't you getting 20%? We got 20% elsewhere. I'm like, well, you got 20% because you may not have gotten concessions in transportation or in school capital, or, whatever else they're giving concessions in. So it's not as easy to compare, but 12 is great, in my opinion.
One of the questions that came in from one of our members ahead of time is essentially why so many apartments and not condos? And could the city either require or encourage condos instead of apartments to have more opportunities for people wanting to come to Falls Church, but also to be homeowners and build equity?
Absolutely. I totally agree. I would love to see more ownership opportunities. And I think we haven't built a condo project since probably the Spectrum. Phil, is that right? Which was maybe 15 years ago at this point. So obviously the condo market was really hot and then it kind of busted. And we're waiting for them to come back. I think for most of the developers that have come forward so far, they are mainly apartment builders. And so they haven't been condo builders. We haven't had the right zoning, frankly, that allows for condos or townhomes or other kinds of ownership opportunities. I would love to see condos, maybe not in these big kind of 4-acre parcels, because again, right now the condo market seems to build much smaller. Like when we looked at what else is, where else is kind of condos happening, there seemed to be more like 100 units or below. And that requires kind of a smaller parcel. So that is something that council has talked about, is where could we create zoning that would enable condos to be built? And that could be things along Park Avenue. Those transitional zones that we have could be a really good way to taper development. So if you have single family homes, think of like 3 or 4 story kind of condo projects that would abut that neighborhood, as opposed to 6 or 7 story that you might see on Broad Street. There are condos proposed and actually in the plans at West Falls Church. So that, I don't remember the exact number of units that we're going to see there, but that will be the next condo project that will be built, is at the 10-acre project next to the high school. So there will be some coming, but I think definitely an opportunity to do more. Phil, anything to add on condos?
No, just that the ones that are going to be at West Falls are going to be pretty premium products. And what we really would hope for would be, some companies that would come to us with proposals for condominiums that were, maybe smaller and not $1 million, but maybe in the $600,000 to $800,000 bracket. That would be the kind of place that somebody might move into if they sold their single family home here now, that still wanted to stay in town.
Yeah, it really brings up kind of I might have talked about in the past, the missing middle. Arlington is doing a whole study around it, but in Falls Church in particular, I always talk about our housing strategy in the past as this barbell, right? So we had a whole bunch of single family homes, and then consciously 20 years ago, we decided to embark on mixed use development. And then we built a whole bunch of apartments. So we have kind of things on either end, but we haven't really done things in the middle, which is really hard if you are someone trying to downsize from your large, 4-bedroom single family home, or if you're trying to go from apartment to something else where you're trying to build wealth and start a family, you don't have anything to go to. And so I see that as kind of a big opportunity for us, both from obviously having more demographic diversity, but economic diversity too. Like that middle market between 600,000 to like 900,000 is really, really hard to find in Falls Church. And we just haven't created the zoning to make it happen, because frankly, the economics are in your single family neighborhoods, teardowns are now selling for $750,000. And to make the economics work, there's no way someone would just stay in there, because they were like, well, guys paid that much for the land, I got to turn that into a $1.6 million house. That is a really tough nut to crack, but that's something that I feel is important for kind of the long-term sustainability of the city. I don't think we want to be a community where we only have really large homes and then only apartments. We got to have kind of that full spectrum. Okay, the last thing I'll mention on development is we actually just yesterday started on planning out the east end of the city. That's kind of the Eden Center, what you might have heard people talk about in the past are called small area plans. And essentially we break out the commercial areas of Falls Church, and small area planning happened even before I was on council. And this is the last of the 8, maybe it's either 7 or 8 small area plans. And so the east end of the city, the community conversation just started yesterday. There was a nice, really good turnout at Columbia Baptist, and they invited kind of folks from the Eden Center and kind of residents in that end of town, like Roosevelt Towers and Madison. I think both of those are actually Madison's definitely a condo project. I'm not sure about Roosevelt, but we had a good turnout from those residents as well, giving input on how they like to see the city invest in that part of town. Any questions on development? Okay, so I'm going to move on to the kind of in order of kind of what I get questions about is probably equity. And Allison, that's one that I think you mentioned.
One question, did you mention also like what's going in around the school, around like what the development's going to happen there? Maybe like,
I couldn't hear the last, was that what's going around near the schools? Is that what you said?
Yeah, for development, like what's coming in there.
Yes. So in that 10-acre development, number one, timing wise, I think we were told they're planning hopefully groundbreaking if everything continues on track this coming spring around kind of the April timeframe. But it is mixed use. At the corner will be a combination of apartments with a large ground floor grocery store. There will be a hotel, an office building, a senior housing building, and condos, and then a civic kind of community space, I think on the ground floor of the condo building, if I remember correctly. And then up and down the main kind of commons area is a large kind of green space. I want to say it totals about an acre plus. Envision that kind of being the main spine that eventually will run through WMATA's development as well as Virginia Tech's development. So our project, while 10 acres, I think is sparking development, hopefully in those adjacent parcels. So all combined will be about 40 acres or so, which is about the size of the Mosaic development that you see. So ours will be the first to break ground and get underway, and the other ones will likely follow.
Letty, can I ask you what might be a dumb question?
Dumb question.
You mentioned the one city center, there's going to be a grocery store. I don't know if there's still Whole Foods going on Broad in Washington. And then if this high school development also has a grocery store, like, is there a chance we're just going to have too many grocery stores? Can we support this many? I know people are home and cooking.
Yes. So in full disclosure, I have 3 kids, and so I'm at the grocery store a whole lot. So my perspective is a little biased. That said, our grocery stores actually right now have been doing really well, and even especially during COVID. One of the reasons why you may have heard us talk about a surplus is our online sales and our local sales tax, especially meals tax and grocery taxes, have been doing really well during COVID. And so obviously it's not just drawing from the 15,000 residents here. A large part of the grocery stores actually attract elsewhere. So yes, Whole Foods is still planned at Broad in Washington. That project likely will also break ground this coming spring. And so as a warning to kind of all your members, it's going to be a mess in the city, I have to say. Just brace yourselves, because you'll have both groundbreaking and construction underway near the high school in one end of town on the west side of the city, and then abroad in Washington. The project will be breaking ground, so just manage your expectations accordingly on what that might look like. I guess I kind of look to the market, right? So the market knows all these grocery stores in town, and they're still proposing more grocery stores. They must have better market data than what I might have as kind of one household. I think the grocery stores have been doing well enough that they are still proposing more, but I hear you. I mean, I think I tend to worry that we're kind of saturating the grocery market. But again, the fact that it's drawing from a larger demographic base than just Falls Church is comforting, because that's actually our favorite kind of customer, right? You don't cost me any money, but you come from elsewhere in the city and you spend here. So, but I hear you. We do have a lot of grocery stores. Any other questions? I mean, just while I pause, like, do you all shop at the same grocery store every week, or do you all go to kind of a couple different ones, or kind of curious?
I alternate every other week.
Oh, I go to the same one just out of habit. But
I go to a couple different ones.
I go to
depending on
mall.
what I want.
Yeah, none of them
That's a
have
good feeling.
everything I want. I go to the mall.
Yeah. I mean, these are, if we're all Falls Church residents and we go to a couple, I mean, that's probably why the businesses are doing so well, right? Like I have a couple standard ones I go to every week, and then once a month I make a trip to Whole Foods, and once a month I'll make a trip to Trader Joe's for things that we would like there, or the H Mart down in Merrifield. And so by the end of the month, I feel like I've gone to 7.
that's true. Yeah, I guess if you look at it that way, yeah, maybe not weekly going to different ones, but
Interesting.
Yeah. And through the, obviously the retail crisis during COVID and even before COVID, grocery stores have been really resilient. People still like to shop for food and cook at home, especially during COVID. And I think people see that that's been one sector of the market that stayed well. Okay, so moving on to equity. I know that's a topic that Allison mentioned your members likely would like to hear about. So things that we've done in the past year. So obviously since the murder of George Floyd, things that we kind of commissioned as a city, the use of force committee wrapped up earlier this year and presented us a report. We've been asking for kind of quarterly updates so that we kind of keep holding ourselves accountable on kind of where we are with this. And so we're expecting our next one actually this coming Monday night. That'll be our fall quarterly report on where we are with kind of the police changes. And then this past budget cycle, we actually started looking at kind of budget appropriations through kind of an equity lens, making sure that we are investing in areas that disproportionately, haven't gotten as much investment. Using that transportation example in South Washington, making sure that when we look at our CIP dollars, transportation, are they equitably distributed? Or in some cases, are we making sure we put more in other areas that haven't gotten as much investment in the past? Boards and commissions this past spring also kind of did their first round of equity reviews, and they came up with a bunch of really good ideas on how we can continue making equity kind of part of the forefront of the decision making. The example that we all like to use and that we all kind of benefit from is the library late fee policy. So if you didn't know it already, the library got rid of late fees, partially because we realized they don't bring a lot of revenue. And when we looked at the data, those fines disproportionately impacted the families that needed library resources the most. And so it just seemed like it would make sense. And so there's other areas like that where we want to make sure that we're looking at policies with that lens. 3 things on the horizon for your members to know about. One, and actually 2 of these hopefully will come up for our discussion this coming Monday night. One is actually getting rid of the citizenship requirement to be in our boards and commissions. So right now, to be a board member, you have to be a resident of the city and you have to be qualified voter, I think is the exact legal term, which essentially means you have to be a US citizen. To me, it just feels like if you are a resident of the city, whether you're here because you have a visa, a green card, military families is often qualifies for as well. You're not registered to vote in Virginia, for example, but you may be living here. You should be able to participate in your government. You should be able to volunteer your time. That is not a change that we can actually make in the city ourselves, because again, we're a Dillon rule state. It's something that is a charter change. And so we're recommending that the General Assembly this coming January, take that up and allow us to change that in our charter. So that's kind of one policy change. A very similar one is actually right now, we require you to be a US citizen to qualify for affordable housing. Apparently it was a change that was added, and then again, before my time and Phil's time in the 90s or early 2000s. And embarrassingly, I only learned about this back in August when Welcoming Falls Church brought it up to me, because they wanted to be able to use the program to welcome more people in the community. And they said, right now you guys are only allowing citizens. And so that was news to me. And I've been on council 5.5 years. So I'm embarrassed to say that I only found out then. But that's a change that we're pursuing. And hopefully we'll discuss this Monday night. So there are 2 policy changes. A third one that I know the league has talked about and spoken in favor of is standing up kind of a formal race and equity commission. And so all this equity work is great. How do we make sure that it's kind of a continuing thing that we invest in, and not just like a one-time, yep, we did an equity review, check the box, we're good. Just like how we have boards and commissions on trees, on history, on transportation, economic development, things that we all value in this community. Hopefully equity is something that can be longstanding like that. And so I've spoken in support of having that, and hopefully it's something that we can get established in the coming year. I will pause there. Questions, comments?
I read recently about complaints from residents of the fields and about the condition of the units and wondering whether the city might get involved, or whether you've already talked to the management there. Anything you can say about that, as well as any thoughts on long-term plans for the fields in terms of the change that'll come up in 6 or so years that is pretty likely to lead to a market rate development unless the city intervenes.
Yep. So let's talk about the near-term one. So we had heard, we got a letter from residents of the fields, and it was actually signed by a good number of them, maybe over 20 or 30 residents, that they were dealing with mold and rats and just really unacceptable living conditions. Frankly, no one should live like that. And the Housing Commission stepped in. So they held a meeting at this point, maybe about 3 weeks ago, at Berman Park, right near the fields. They invited Legal Services of Northern Virginia, which is kind of a pro bono kind of nonprofit law firm working on tenant issues like this. They invited Kettler Management. Kettler is the private developer that manages and owns the fields. And it was really good community turnout. It was probably the best turnout I've seen in a community meeting for any topic. And so I think, again, it really stresses the importance of, number one, going to the people. We can't expect people to come to City Hall all the time. Sometimes you have to go out to the community. So that was good to do. But it was really good just to bring both the residents there to voice their concerns. We had translators there, so it was very open, accessible. The attorney was able to provide some guidance on various things, and then Kettler could hear loud and clear what the issues were. So I'm very grateful to the Housing Commission for stepping in. We actually invited Kettler to come join us at our meeting this coming Monday night, because I want to make sure I keep putting some pressure on them to address those issues. Again, no one should be living with rats and mold. And they had assured us they were going unit by unit to check for issues. And so hopefully this coming Monday night, they'll give us a report out on where they are. Hopefully they've rectified those issues. If not, the next step will be to send in some health inspectors and building inspectors, which we've tried to do in the past. The main change from what we've tried to do in the past is residents weren't willing to be identified in the past. So it's really hard for inspectors to only do exterior inspecting without being able to go in the units. I think, frankly, residents got concerned enough that they were willing to put their names on paper and write us a letter and identify which units had the issues. So that gives the city a little more power in trying to help enforce a lot of the rules in place. And then long-term, Allison, you mentioned what's the plan there. So for those of you who don't know this, the Fields is the residential development behind the Taco Bell off Ellison Street. It's about 90, I want to say it's 96 units, and they are affordable right now. They work under the tax credit program, so they are targeted at kind of 60% of area median income. And frankly, that's where a large part of the city's diverse community lives. So it really would be a shame to lose that when that affordability provision expires in about 7 years. Right now, we had consultants about a year ago kind of help us formulate a strategy. Speaking for myself only, I would love to see some sort of kind of redevelopment opportunity, because those are older buildings. And again, they weren't in great condition because you're hearing of things like mold and rats and, just lots of maintenance concerns. I would love to see some sort of redevelopment option where we can preserve the affordability of 96 units and maybe add some market rate units in there to make it kind of worth their while. That's one option. I think other options are you could throw a bunch of money at it and buy out the private developer, but without any action, essentially those units, all 96 of them convert to market rate. And obviously the developer has they can make a lot of money from that. So we have to figure out what the right strategy there is. But that is kind of a ticking alarm in the back of my mind all the time of what we should be doing there. Phil, anything to add?
No, I don't think so. Just tune in Monday night, because when the Kettler folks come before us, I hope that they'll have answers to some of the questions that were raised at the community meeting, which, as Letty says, were truly troubling.
Yeah, the main promising thing is that they've changed over the entire property management team that oversees the fields. So hopefully that the current team will be more responsive to the citizen concerns. Because obviously the residents wouldn't be coming to the city unless they've tried their avenues and felt that they were not getting responses. No one should be able to, no one needs to turn to the city. They should be able to go to their landlord directly, and they obviously weren't getting a very responsive landlord up until now. So that probably transitions nicely to affordable housing, because I know that's been a topic that the league's been interested in. So I briefly mentioned how Founders Row 1 will be the first project with affordable units that never expire. That's kind of a going forward policy change. So pretty much every project that we've approved since then. So the West Falls project, the 10 acres next to the high school, has units that never expire. Broad in Washington has units that never expire. And then all the new ones in the queue that we're discussing now won't expire. So that's great. Hopefully that 6% to 10 or upwards will be kind of a new expectation as well. Again, because these are voluntary concessions, we don't get to demand it, but it is nice to say that, hey, that's a new bar that you should be, it'd be nice for people to meet. So that's a really good recent win. I don't know whether I've talked about the Amazon grants in the past, but the city also won Amazon grants last spring, and it's going to go to 2 areas. One is, remember I talked about how the previous buildings had units that were expiring. The one in particular we're trying to keep from expiring is the Reed building. That's the one above the PNC Bank. It's a pretty small project right next to is it the Chevron, which is the gas station right off Virginia and Broad. So the PNC Bank Reed building there, that actually has units in there dedicated for teachers. Those are set to expire this year. And so we took some of the Amazon grant money to extend the affordability for another 10 or 15 years. So that's good. That's something that, again, it takes money to extend these affordability provisions. But a large part of the Amazon grant that we won is actually going to go towards an ownership program. So we recognize that we've mainly been creating affordable rental opportunities, and being able to afford homes is important. And so it's going to go towards kind of this revolving fund where we buy up market rate houses, essentially probably likely condos and townhomes, between 500 and 650 or so, if we can find them. With the way the housing market's been going in the city, that might be a little challenging, but essentially buy them and then sell them at a more affordable, maybe between 60 to 80% of area median income affordable. And then that'll be create a home ownership opportunity. And then when that person decides to sell, there's some sort of equity sharing arrangement where that family might get some of the equity returns back to the city in that equity, in that revolving fund, which then again fund future purchases as well. So that's hopefully a program that we'll be able to launch soon. We won that grant in the spring, but Virginia Housing, which manages the grant program, obviously got really taxed during COVID. And so we're looking to hopefully stand up that program whenever they're ready. The other big win in the spring is the city purchased a whole bunch of quads in Virginia Village. Virginia Village is the South Maple. There's 20 kind of these brick quads. So there's 4 units each, essentially a little north of where Pizzeria Orso is, if you're familiar, kind of between the park there, the Bowl America, and Pizzeria Orso is about 20 quads. At the beginning of the year, we owned 1 in the city. And then by April, I think we owned 4. So that's quite an accomplishment in partnership with the Economic Development Authority. They helped help us with those purchases. So the long-term vision there is being able to preserve a lot more of those quads and potentially redevelop them, because that is a large parcel of land that could create a whole bunch more affordable housing than what we have there already.
And what would that, I mean, is that like in 5 years you decide about keeping them or versus redeveloping, or more like 15 years from now or 2 years from now? What's the,
Yeah, right now we have 4 out of 20. And they're not all contiguous. And so that doesn't create, you can't do much with that, right? And so part of it is figuring out the plan. Like, do you need all 20 of them to redevelop, or could you just have 10 of them on one side of the property? Or if we decide we need all 20, do we go out with a proactive strategy where we try to buy the rest of them up, and then where do we get that money? And so we actually just applied for another round of Amazon funding to try to actually create a strike fund so that if another one comes up on the market, we're ready to go. But I don't have more answers beyond that. Like, I think the timing obviously depends on how many we need to buy, which ones we need to buy, when the money comes. But I definitely think it's more of a long-term thing. Like, I don't think maybe I'll be surprised. I don't think we can acquire the remaining, 15 in the next 5 years. It's definitely more of a long-term play. And we probably likely need a partner, because that's a pretty big undertaking. But overall, if I take a step back between kind of getting 10 and 12% affordable housing units in this inclusionary zone, like, so when we have new buildings getting 10 and 12%, the Amazon grant, buying quads, we allocated money in our budget for the first time. When I take a step back, I mean, we really are making big strides in affordable housing that we as a community should be very proud of. I think in the past, we keep talking about affordable housing and how it's important. And for the first time this past year, we're actually starting to put dollars against it, dollars in actual strategies and commitments and plans. I always say that policies are only as good as if you're actually willing to fund them, right? Like, you can make a policy, but if it sits on a shelf, nothing's ever going to happen with it. So I'm glad to personally see us willing to put dollars behind this. Questions on housing? And it doesn't have to be about just affordable. We can talk about other things too. Phil, do you want to chime in on any housing topics?
Well, the Virginia Village project is one of those, hope that it takes 5 years, expect that it'll take 15. That's exactly right. But that really is the biggest opportunity to really move the needle. I mean, if we could do a consolidated development there and have, 80 affordable units in a building that had 80 more mixed income units, that would be a big deal if we could pull that off. But we would need a partner and community commitment to make that happen over, a 4 to 6 year period of time it would probably take.
Okay. So I'm going to close out with kind of one topic that think, again, we all support, but I probably want to see more attention on. So as I think about in the next kind of 2 years, when we put together the council work plan, is really around climate. I think it's definitely out of my wheelhouse. I know far less about this than, say, housing. But when I, again, take a step back and think about where we really need to focus as a community, that should really be our next big shared existential crisis, right? So obviously between the IPCC report that came out a couple months ago, as well as the Glasgow hearings that are going right now, that is something that collectively needs a lot more attention. I think as a community, we look at ourselves as being pretty progressive and green. You know, we often brag about our recycling habits. We won an award for being the first curbside composting program in Virginia. So there are a lot of things that we're proud of. But I really would love to see some kind of simple, bold declarations come from the city on what we should do about climate change. The biggest thing that we often don't give ourselves credit for is all this mixed use development is actually one of the best ways to help with climate, right? Because if people can live where they work and where they shop and they don't have a use to drive their car everywhere, that helps a whole lot. We don't often associate mixed use with being greener, but that is actually one of the best things we can do is think about urban design and planning how we want to live and create our cities. But recently, I think last week, I saw an article that Ithaca, New York was the first city to vote to decarbonize the city. And they partnered with Cornell University on how to retrofit all their city public buildings and private buildings to decarbonize, to get rid of all their gas appliances and add solar panels, essentially get all their buildings in a much better shape. And so I always joke, I'm like, I don't mind being number two. Like it's often imitation is a good form of flattery. And so I'd love for us to figure out if that's a strategy we should go for in Falls Church. We are small enough that things like that we should be a lot more nimble at than a larger jurisdiction. That's something that we had a work plan that we reviewed probably about 3 weeks ago or so. We had kind of a discussion on what we should do about climate. It is such a big, hairy problem, kind of like affordable housing, that I feel really daunting. But when I think about, again, our work plan for the coming 2 years, that is a place where I'd love to see a lot more action from the city and hopefully be able to lead in this region too.
Do we have an aspirational goal for the city to be net neutral?
I have not seen one yet. I think regionally we are part of the plan to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions, and I don't remember the percent, by 2040. So we're part of that regional plan. But I'll be very frank, is that the region as a whole, Falls Church included, we are falling short of that. And so I don't think we've called it a big enough crisis yet. I felt like we did that with housing a couple of years ago, and that's really stepped on the gas with a lot of housing initiatives. I feel like we need to do the same around climate. I think stormwater is definitely an area that we can focus on. I think it certainly helps with the resilience. Everyone knows that every time it rains, it seems to rain harder and longer. And we have, some definitely parts of the city that are more prone to flooding. And so a large part of the ARPA allocation I talked about at the beginning will go towards stormwater resilience with, potentially bigger pipes. But green infrastructure is a big part of it too. So when we talk about gray infrastructure versus green infrastructure, gray is essentially bigger and more stormwater pipes that carry water away. Green infrastructure are things like swales and trees and things that soak up the water so that it has less washing down into those pipes. So you really need a combination of both things. So hopefully, stormwater will be part of that climate discussion. But to your point, though, I think we need some sort of bold, decisive goal. Like, what are we shooting for? Like, what is the thing that we need to rally around in this community? Incrementally, I think we're doing fine. We're adding car chargers. We have a net zero ready high school. We have mixed use development where people can, live closer to where they, work and play. But I would love to see a lot more attention around what we should do about climate change.
Is it too late for all the projects underway to figure out a way to get them to commit to climate goals?
Yes, and so for the new developments underway, they all kind of meet some sort of LEED standard. I want to say the One City Center project, as well as Founders Road 2, those two projects that are in the queue that I talked about, those both achieve LEED Gold, which is higher than we've seen with previous projects. So the bar is going higher. They also commit to something called 20% EUI reduction. EUI is energy usage intensity. So they're essentially committing to using 20% less energy. And so that's also great. They also do a whole bunch of stormwater retention. That's one of the benefits we often don't talk about with mixed uses. For example, in both of those, in the Founders Road project, the Rite Aid site and the carpet store is largely impervious parking lot. And so while a big mixed use project is planned there, it's actually going to do better for stormwater because they're going to have giant tanks that capture water. So they're committing to 20% less runoff than is currently on the site. So I'm actually not too concerned about mixed use because in the mixed use projects, we get to negotiate concessions, and concessions like housing that we often talk about, but we get a lot of concessions around stormwater and climate. It's what we all do in our residential neighborhoods as well that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. Good question though. What do you all see as kind of within climate as important to focus on?
Well, I saw that Ithaca thing, and I think that maybe, having them be the first mover is just maybe watching closely what they do and how they did it, maybe, and seeing how it goes so that we might learn from them would be a great way to think about it. Because clearly they've done a lot of thinking, so maybe starting by learning from what they've learned so far.
Yeah. I think when we looked at our plan a couple of weeks ago, the one thing that was a really eye opener for me is actually out of the total greenhouse gas kind of emissions that come from the city, very, very little, I want to say it was 1% of it comes from city buildings and city schools. And so while it's great that our high school is going to be net zero ready, and if we could probably retrofit City Hall and all the other buildings that we have in town, it actually contributes very little in the grand scheme of things. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because I think it's important for us to lead by example. But that was just good context to have, is that while we can do our part in local government to change our buildings and change out our city fleet to be electric vehicles, it's really the entirety of the city that needs to kind of take on this challenge.
So maybe looking at working with utilities and seeing, what it takes to increase solar use, or are there any kind of business, or deals we can offer through the utilities that would move things along?
Yep.
And also
Yeah,
having all these new developments, have charging for, electrification for cars, those kind of things, make it easy. Because, if you live in an apartment building and you don't have access to easy charging, that's definitely a huge disincentive from electrification.
Yeah, that is a new standard that our colleague Debbie Hescott has pushed on, is having a standard of number of car chargers inside each of these buildings. I want to say it's 5% of all the spaces should be dedicated to electric vehicle charging. Is kind of a standard that's recommended from our Environmental Sustainability Council. Yes, again, on the kind of mixed use front, I'm actually feeling pretty good about how green and I guess less energy usage and polluting I think those new buildings are. It's really across the rest of the city that's much harder nut to crack, because we have to approve those projects and we get to kind of essentially negotiate with them to make them green. It's much harder for all the residential buildings across the city. Like our individual homes and our individual behaviors is a much harder one. And sometimes it takes some financial incentives to kind of get us there.
Yeah, that's why maybe partnering with, like, talking to the utilities and seeing if sometimes they'll do incentives, sometimes not, because there's a lot of disincentives, but there might be some that would be, I don't know.
Yep.
I'm also wondering if we're partnering with George Mason I haven't read the thing about Ithaca, but my assumption is Cornell gave the Ithaca project a big boost. And I'm wondering, since we have George Mason and Virginia Tech in our area, if there's anything we can do with them.
Definitely. Especially being in a small city, I think we always welcome having universities help give us free labor or free advice.
I'm mindful that we're over time and you've been very, very generous with it. So I always love listening to you. So I know you said you didn't want to talk much, but I personally love listening to you. So thank you.
Thank you. Did I cover kind of all the big areas that you all think your members most likely want to hear from or hear about?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to our members who have joined us and audience members. So we really appreciate it. It's been a great session.